tiny people. You know what would be good right about now? A history lesson. You know what would even be even better? A history lesson about a great big battle in the Civil War. This is the first of the really large battles, the Battle of Shiloh, also known as Pittsburgh Landing. As I explained before, almost every battle in the Civil War had two names. It's most frequently referred to as Shiloh. The Northern commanders, there were two of them. The senior commander was Ulysses S. Grant. Actually, that's not true. His name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. Yeah, you just learned something fascinating and fantastic. You see, the President of the United States, he would be number 18. There never was a Ulysses S. Grant. There was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. As a kid, he hated the initials HUG, so he used his middle name Ulysses, and his brother's name was Simpson. And when he made his appointment to West Point to go to the nation's military academy, it got messed up with some of his brother's paperwork, and he wound up being Ulysses Simpson Grant. And that's how he was approved to go to West Point. The only way he could go was to change his name. So he became Ulysses S. Grant so he could take his appointment to West Point. He was in overall command. He was waiting to meet up with General Don Carlos Buell, who was coming to meet him with reinforcements. Together, the two armies were going to merge and then head south. Now, let me explain something to you about military maps. Any American military map, if you look at the blue, not the rivers, obviously, but the blue arrows, that tells you where the United States forces were and in what directions they were moving. The red is always the enemy. In this case, that would be the Confederacy. But if you looked at a map of World War II, it could be the Germans, it could be the Japanese, depending on which theater of operations you were looking at a map of. So Grant and Buell were going to meet in western Tennessee and then invade into the South. The Southern commanders, and again, there were two of them. The first was a man by the name of Albert Sidney Johnston, and he was in overall command. Remember that little clue I gave you. If you see a T in the name Johnson, so that it's Johnston, then that means it's a Southerner. There were a couple of very big ones important to the military history of the Confederacy. Albert Sidney Johnston had served in the American Army for a number of years. He was considered to be the finest general that the South had. Albert Sidney Johnston was the guy that was going to make the difference. He was the one that everybody respected. At the end of the Civil War, actually after the Civil War, during his presidency, someone asked Ulysses Grant, who would rise up to become the greatest of the Northern commanders, they asked him, was there any Southern general that you feared? And Grant immediately said, only Albert Sidney Johnston. The second in command for the Southern forces was our old friend Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, the Southern general from Louisiana who had won the victory at Fort Sumter, had won the victory at the First Battle of Bull Run, and was now second in command to Albert Sidney Johnston. Now, where these people were positioned, the Northern Army under General Grant, remember they were going to wait for Don Carlos Buell's forces. Well, Grant had marched them long and hard over to this position near Shiloh Church in southern Tennessee. And he said, you know, military science tells us what we should do is we should dig in. And what they had back in the Civil War was that little tool you see on the left, kind of like a weird looking hatchet. And that was what they'd use to build a little trench. Don't know if you know this or not, but most injuries, most deaths that occur on a battlefield are not from bullets. As a matter of fact, there were some studies done in some of the battlefields from the Civil War by historians years later, and their best estimate was that at some places, as many as 10,000 bullets were fired for every one person that was killed by a bullet. So what they'd do would be they'd be killed, or what would happen would be soldiers were killed by things flying around the battlefield. A cannonball might hit a tree, shred the tree into 1,000 pieces, all of which fly into the enemy forces. It's more likely to be killed by a piece of a tree than it is by a bullet or a rock or any number of other things flying around. So, how does one protect oneself? Well, that's easy. Dig a trench, dig a hole in the ground and crawl into it, because as all those things fly around the battlefield, they don't come down into a hole, they pass over the top of it. So, ordinarily, when an army is getting ready to stay in a position for any amount of time, they will do what's called entrenching. They'll take a tool, now it's modern day tool is a little bit more similar to a shovel, but they'll dig themselves a trench deep enough at least to lie down in, so that if anything would happen, if there was an attack, artillery shells came in during the night, then all of those pieces of shrapnel, all those pieces of busted up material would fly over their heads and they would remain safe in their trenches. Well, Grant had found a lovely place for them to camp. It was in a peach orchard right next to a deep forest. And they thought, Grant thought, this is such a nice place. I'm not going to make these guys who have done all this work, all this marching, I'm not going to make them entrench, because I don't think there's any Confederate force anywhere near here. So Grant was pretty sure of himself. He thought the men would just pretty much camp out and wait for Don Carlos Buell. Now, the Southerners, on the other hand, were marching up. They were aware of Grant's army. And they thought, well, we're going to get ourselves a surprise attack. At least that's what the commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, thought. However, these were raw recruits. I picked this picture because it's really rather accurate. They still weren't wearing the same uniforms, and they really didn't have all the same rifle or musket, and they weren't terribly organized. Now, these were country boys, and they were thinking, oh, we're going to get in that fight. We're going to kill us some Yankees. And so they were getting ready. They were marching along, and they thought, hey, Elmer, does your gun work? Well, let's find out. They shot off a gun. Somebody else shoots off a gun. Then they'd get all excited about going into battle. Yeehaw! Going to kill us some Yankees. And they'd be all ready to go and making so much noise that General Beauregard said to General Johnston, we have to call this off. The Union would have to be deaf if they haven't heard us coming. They must know where our position is and that we're coming after them. Well, the Union didn't. On the morning of April 6th, 1862, General Johnston had decided to continue with his surprise attack plan. So there were the Northern troops. Now, when an army goes into bivouac for the night, they'll stack their weapons up, not right next to them, but in piles by company or platoon. They're also down in tents or covered up with blankets, and they weren't really ready. They're doing what guys do when they camp. Some of them are off behind a tree peeing. Some of them are cooking breakfast. Some of them are shaving. All of a sudden, out of the woods, run a couple of rabbits, then a couple of fox, then a couple of deer, and then 40,000 Confederates. The Union was completely surprised by this. They weren't prepared in any way. The Union was pushed back, and this is still continuing on the first day, April 6, 1862. The Union was pushed back. They were disorganized. The first few hundred people couldn't even get to their weapons and defend themselves. It looked like it was going to be another rout. But somewhere along the way, one of the Union outfits held, and it was joined by other Union outfits. But there was that one spot in the center of the Northern line, and they managed to get themselves a position where the Confederates couldn't knock them out. They tried 12 times over the course of the day to push the Union soldiers back. The Southerners started to call this the Hornet's Nest. You guys are familiar with a hornet's nest, like what's down there in the lower center of that picture. They call it the Hornet's Nest because if you go up there, you're going to get stung, because there was a lot of killing going on from the Union side. General Albert Sidney Johnston, this great man who was supposed to be the finest of the Southern generals, came riding up on his horse to see what was holding up his attack. And he was shot right near his crotch. Now, that's a very common wound for officers in the Civil War. What happens is they were sitting on horseback, so their waist was up near where a standing man's shoulder would be. And the standing men were holding their muskets up on their shoulders. And when they fired, it was the right height. Lots of officers were killed by being hit inside the leg. That happened to Albert Sidney Johnston. He was shot, it busted an artery, and the greatest general of the Confederacy bled to death on the first day of his first battle. It took until 5:30 for the Union to make the for the Confederacy to make the Union surrender the Hornets' Nest. Grant had used that day, and again, I'm going to remind you that the lines in red, and you see those advancing, those would be the Southerners. Those are the enemies of the United States. And the lines in blue, those are the Union, the Northern, the American soldiers. They started off facing each other when Johnston led his surprise attack. Then you see the dotted lines in blue. That is the American army retreating. They're going back to a little town along the Tennessee River called Pittsburgh Landing, which is where this battle gets its other name. Grant had the idea that he was being overwhelmed. He had managed, because of how the Hornets' Nest had held out, he had had time to get back to Pittsburgh Landing and create some defensive works. He hoped to hold the enemy off until he could get some boats there, load his army onto boats, and sail off so that he would be able to fight again. Please also notice that now the commanding general for the South is Beauregard, because Albert Sidney Johnston had been killed earlier in the day. Okay, here's where you need a gallon of milk. A gallon of water will do fine. You see, Northern reinforcements were coming. Don Carlos Buell had 25,000 fresh men who came in during the night. Now, if you take your gallon of milk or water, what I want you to do is take both your arms, grab a hold of the handle of that gallon of milk, and hold it out, and just hold it for a full minute if you can. I'm not going to wait for the full minute, but you hold it out there and time yourself. You can stop this video for that full minute. All right, coming back, a gallon of milk or a gallon of water weigh about 8.5 pounds. A Civil War musket weighs about 9.5 pounds. Now, think about this. These people are lined up, one behind the other, fighting. There's obviously a front row. The front row, they may be able to get off a shot or two, but these muskets don't have more than one round before they have to start swinging the butt of the musket and using the bayonet and trying to block and parry and stab and thrust as best they can. Think about holding up that gallon of milk and now realize that these guys had to swing their rifles around after they'd fired their shot and just keep doing it, because as soon as you put the as soon as you put the musket down, then you're the next casualty. So these people would fight until they were just too exhausted, and then they'd be either wounded or killed. Don Carlos Buell came up during the night with 25,000 men, and they had marched more than 12 miles the day before, which sounds like an awfully long hike, and you'd think they'd be tired. But think about them in comparison with all those thousands of men who had been fighting all day, swinging those rifles and into hand-to-hand combat. There was another Northern general who was supposed to get his troops into position, General Lew Wallace. He didn't show up. He sort of got lost in the woods. Have you ever heard of her? I don't mean him. I mean her. Lew Wallace is the man who, after the Civil War, wrote the novel Ben-Hur. You might have seen the movie. There are a couple of versions of it now. Ben-Hur is a story about a man who gains religion. And it was written by Lew Wallace years after the war, because during the Civil War, Lew Wallace had seen such horrible carnage, such terrible bloody things, that he said there can't be a God. There's no way, if there is a merciful God, that he would allow this to happen. And Lew Wallace completely lost his faith. And it was some years after the Civil War, which would end in 1865, that Lew Wallace got his faith back. And as a part of that, he wrote the novel Ben-Hur. It was published in 1877, so it did take him a few years to get back, but he did die a religious man. The second day, PGT Beauregard realized that now with those fresh men, Grant outnumbers him. Grant has the advantage because Grant threw everything at the Southerners the next day. Beauregard knew he had to retreat. But this is not going to be a rout like the North did at Bull Run. This is going to be a retrograde action. And remember what that is. That is when an army leaves in an orderly fashion, and part of the army, usually the cavalry, the soldiers mounted on horseback, stay behind and continue to fight to hold the enemy back. That was Beauregard's plan. And the man he left to slow up the Union from following him was a man by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. That's his picture there on the right. You know, it fascinates me. That is a man who was a brilliant cavalry officer, nearly completely uneducated in a formal way, but boy, he knew how to fight. But he was a man completely filled with hate. He is one of the men who started the Ku Klux Klan. Grant didn't follow up. You might remember when we talked about the American Revolution, I said, boy, if I were going to have a fight with one of you kids, which is always a very real possibility because I just kind of hold that as a dream. Anyway, suppose that I am fighting with, let's see, let's pick somebody fair. How about Cole Candula? All right, I'm fighting with Cole, and he happens to get in a lucky shot. Cole kicks me right in the knee, and I bend over, and I am in pain. I can't stand it. What should Cole do? And in the class, you guys said, well, he should run away, I guess. And that might not be a bad alternative. He certainly shouldn't come close to me where I could grab him. I'm too big. But he could pick up a chair, pick up a stick, pick up anything he wanted to, and just keep beating me. Because what we're talking about, is a war. It's a fight. And a fight isn't over until one side either surrenders or can no longer fight. Grant didn't follow up. That was a big mistake, but it's understandable. Out of the 67,000 men that Ulysses Grant commanded at Shiloh, 13,500 of them were casualties. Remember, a casualty is either a soldier who is killed or wounded so badly that he cannot continue to fight. 13,500 out of 67. The South lost 11,500 casualties out of a total of 43,000 men who were on the battlefield. The reason Grant didn't follow could have been the immensity of what he saw. The biggest battle in the American Revolution had 1,050 casualties. The biggest battle in the War of 1812 had 800 casualties. This is on the American side. The Mexican-American War, and Grant had fought in that, the biggest battle had 800 casualties. And Ulysses Grant, at the end of the day, was looking over a battlefield with 25,000 casualties, 25,000 men who were dead or wounded so badly they couldn't continue in their job as soldiers. This must have been an amazing sight. Ulysses Grant was a very complicated man. One of the things that I found most interesting about him and what I've read is that he couldn't stand the sight of blood. Of bloody meat. Anyway, when he ate meat, he charred it black. He couldn't look at it, I think because of what he'd seen on battlefields. I'll tell you one more story about Ulysses Grant because I just think this is a great one. He lived in Galena, Illinois before the war. He was a shopkeeper, and his house was up on top of a hill where he had to climb a great big staircase to get up to his house. And when he came there, he'd get to the top of the stairs, and one of his sons would meet him there, a boy who was about 10 years old at the time. And every day they kind of had a little ceremony. The son would say, "Hey, mister, you want to fight?" And Grant would say to his son, "I am a peaceful man, but I will not be hectored by a man of your size." And then they'd get to wrestling. They'd wrestle till they went home and had dinner. The end of the Battle of Shiloh, the real importance was that the anaconda was starting to squeeze. Western Tennessee was lost to the Confederacy. It now belonged to the Union, and the South would never get it back. So remember that idea. The anaconda said cut off the trade north to south, naval blockade around the Confederate coast, capture and control the Mississippi River, and then squeeze the Eastern Confederacy. Well, when you look at the area controlled by the South, the Battle of Shiloh, Grant was taking a large portion, a big chunk of the top of the Mississippi River. So the anaconda was starting to squeeze. All right, tiny people, just because I know you're dying for it, remember there is another Civil War quiz next Friday. And remember also that the Adams section will be the ones writing an essay. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison are going to be good enough to take an online quiz for me. Thank you, tiny people. Hey, let's do it again on Monday. Oh, yeah. Hasta la vista, babies.